And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is August the 19th, the 231st day of this year. Just 134 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll be starting a new one. Well, this is a World Humanitarian Day, National Aviation Day, and the birthday of aviation pioneer Orville Wright. It also marks certain historical milestones like Afghanistan's independence in 1919 and notable celebrity birthdays, including Coco Chanel and Bill Clinton and Matthew Perry. It's also National Potato Day and Soft Ice Cream Day. In 1919, Afghanistan got full independence from British control. 1958, U.S. and U.K. backed coup overthrows Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And in 2003, a deadly bomb hits the Canal Hotel in Baghdad, targeting the UN humanitarian workers. Yes, it was quite a interesting period of time. Well, let us see what stories we have in the news today, because we do live in interesting times, no question about that. Well, a socialist had captured a major Florida victory on a hit-or-miss night for Trump-endorsed primary candidates. Tuesday night's primary elections featured closely watched federal races from sunny South Florida to the frigid Alaskan tundra, and two seats in between, all of which help decide whether Republicans maintain control of Congress or the Democrats overtake them. Three states also featured critical gubernatorial primary elections. Observers are already using the race results as bellwethers to gauge President Trump's grip over the GOP and the power of the emergent socialist movement. Well, Florida socialist scores a shocking Senate upset despite being heavily outspent. The socialists will have a chance to unseat a sitting Republican senator after upsetting a heavily favored opponent who outspent her 9-1. Democratic Socialist of America member and Democratic State Representative Angie Nixon scored a massive upset in the state's Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. Nixon ran against retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, prominent critic of President Trump, who played a central role in the left's failed 2019 impeachment attempt that was expected to emerge victorious. She defeated Vindman by almost 12 points, despite his $16.3 million war chest, compared to hers of only about $1 million. And as of July, Vindman had spent about $9 million on the race, while Nixon had spent just over $700,000. Nixon squared off in a statewide race against Senator Ashley Moody, Republican of Florida. Trump has a hit-or-miss endorsement night. Across the country, some of President Trump's endorsed candidates won their respective races. Some others struggled. President Trump endorsed Representative Byron Donalds, Republican of Florida. He won the Sunshine State's Republican gubernatorial primary against a field that included Lieutenant Governor Jay Collins and outsider James Fishback. Donalds won 47% compared to 25% for Collins and 10.5% for Fishback. Donalds will face former Florida Republican Congressman turned Democratic David Jolly, who won the nod for the job on the Democratic side. Likewise, Republican Senator Ashley Moody, herself a Trump endorsee, took home a victory in a special Senate primary election, finished the remainder of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's U.S. Senate term, which ends in 2028. Moody was appointed to the seat last year after Rubio joined the Trump administration. Republican Representative Randy Fine of Florida's 6th Congressional District, also endorsed by Trump, easily won his reelection bid. But it wasn't all smiles for Team Trump. Scandal-plagued incumbent Representative Corey Mills, Republican of Florida, who represents the state's 7th Congressional District, lost his race to challenger and former TV anchor Ryan Elijah. Trump endorsed Mills in February, but the congressman's facing a wide-ranging Health Ethics Committee investigation into possible campaign finance violations, allegations of assault against a romantic partner, and allegations of improperly receiving or soliciting gifts. He, of course, has denied any wrongdoing. 7th District leans red, meaning Elijah should have an edge come in November. Meanwhile, Catalina Loff, who's scored an 11th-hour endorsement from Trump last week, lost her bid to fill Donald's seat in Florida's 19th Congressional District in a race that featured several unusual political twists. Media executive Jim Swartzel won the five-way race with 29.1% of the vote. Loff got 22%. Businessman Jim Oberweis placed third with 15.7% of the vote. Loff and Oberweis were familiar rivals, having squared off in a crowded Midwestern Republican primary years ago. Both ran in Illinois' 14th Congressional District back in 2020. Oberweis won that round and lost to a Democrat in the general election. 2 years later, Loff ran successfully in Illinois' 11th Congressional District, though that race didn't feature Oberweis. In Wyoming, a similar story played out in that state. In Wyoming's U.S. Senate primary, Trump endorsed Representative Harriet Hagerman, who serves as the state at-large congresswoman, won in a landslide. Defeated cattle rancher Sam Mead. 80% of the vote counted. Hagerman held a 62% to 28% lead over Mead. Three others lagging well behind as well. However, in Wyoming's gubernatorial primary, Republican voters spurned Trump's choice, electing State Senator Eric Barlow over Megan Dingenfelder, state's superintendent of public instruction. Barlow also won decidedly, holding a lead of 50% to Dingenfelder's 29.7% with three-quarters of the votes counted. Both races were called shortly after the polls closed. Wyoming Secretary of State Chuck Gray won a competitive five-way primary, getting 25% of the vote. Businessman Steve Friess earned 20.7% of the vote. Army veteran Keith Christensen won 17.8%. State hadn't elected a Democrat in a statewide race since 2006, and that trend is likely to continue in November. In Alaska, incumbent Representative Senator Dan Sullivan finished second in the state's nonpartisan primaries. And to move on to the general election, where he'll face three other candidates, including former Democratic Congresswoman Mary Patola, the top vote getter in November. Trump buried the losses in a post on Truth Social. He said a lot of great wins took place tonight. Moderate Democrats fend off far left in the Florida House races. On the House side, a familiar face won in a newly redrawn 20th Congressional District in Florida. Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democratic of Florida, was drawn out of the 25th District, which she currently represents. She defeated four other candidates, including self-proclaimed socialist activist Elijah Manley, a serious contender who raised nearly $1 million in his bid. Despite the fundraising haul, he placed third behind former mayor of Broward County, Dale Holness. Well, let's see what else happened last night. One of the most closely watched Senate races in the country is going on in Alaska, as Republicans cling to a narrow majority in the upper chamber. Alaska's nonpartisan top four primary elections, meaning that candidates from all parties compete in an open race. The top four vote getters advance to the general election. And in the general election, the state uses ranked choice voting. Trump-endorsed Republican Senator Dan Sullivan faced 15 primary challenges, including former Democratic Representative Mary Patola and a retired teacher. Incumbent Sullivan was second in voting at the time the race was called and move on to the general election. Patola lost her seat to Republican Representative Nick Begich. The third in 2024 was in first and held a razor-thin lead of less than 1%. Alaska's only member of the House, Begich, will be on the ballot in November as he battles to keep his seat. Be joined by independent fisherman Bill Hill, who, while two additional spots in the four-candidate field remain uncalled early Wednesday morning. Well, it's amazing. Voters keep sending socialists to the top spots in elections. America's reddest state crowns a GOP governor nominee. Wyoming Republicans chose former state House Speaker and current state Senator Eric Barlow on Tuesday as their nominee for governor in the race to seat outgoing Governor Mark Gordon. Selection tees up the likely next person to move to the governor's mansion in January, considering the deep red roots that run in Wyoming's statewide officials. Gordon considered seeking a third term and challenging Wyoming's two-term limit law before ultimately deciding against another bid. This left Republicans with an open contest to replace him in November's midterms. Trump-endorsed State Superintendent Megan Degenfelder came in second behind Barlow Tuesday, while Marine Corps Colonel and 2022 gubernatorial candidate Brent Bine finished third. Well, socialist candidates can delete old posts, but they can't erase their radicalism. This summer, as millions of Americans are enjoying fireworks or gearing up for the fall football season, campaign for the Democratic Senate candidate in Michigan was scrambling to cover up past statements denouncing both. The campaign of Abdul al-Sayed was caught red-handed by CNN erasing hot takes, declaring that fireworks suck and linking football to slavery. On one hand, you can't blame him. Al-Sayed is running for statewide office in Michigan, which voted for President Trump twice in the last decade. Better to take the hit on the flip-flop and sell voters on his canned declaration about his love for Michigan football on Saturdays than defend the indefensible. On the other hand, if character's what counts when nobody's watching, Al-Sayed has shown who he is, and voters ought to believe him. To be fair, he's not the only candidate navigating the collision course between a hard-left worldview and the political realities of getting elected in a center-right country. In Irving, Wisconsin, Francesca Hong, Democratic Socialist candidate, came up just short in her gubernatorial primary. Like al-Sayed, her past social media commentary surfaced before Election Day, including her support for canceling Thanksgiving. In the home stretch, Hong's campaign was overrun with similar questions about some of her past and current extremist views. At one point, the candidate even declared Thanksgiving her favorite holiday, but the damage was done. Well, mother of three was killed when a massive tree crashed onto her SUV in a freak highway accident. Ohio mother of three was killed after a massive tree crashed down on her SUV as she drove along a highway over the weekend. Bridget Reagan, 35 of Minerva, was behind the wheel of a 2023 Jeep Wagoneer traveling west on U.S. Route 30 in Paris Township about 5:24 in the afternoon on Saturday when a tree toppled from a wooded area and crashed onto the vehicle. That's according to State Highway Patrol. She was pronounced dead at the scene. We're trying to determine whether or not the ground was saturated, if the tree was rotted, or things like that. Everything points to it being an act of God, according to Lieutenant Johnny Mayer of the Ohio State Highway Patrol. This could have happened to anybody, but in this case, it happened to a young lady with a family, he said. Reagan was a small business owner and well-known member of the Minerva community, where she owned Chick Haven, a clothing and home decor boutique. Her sudden death prompted an outpouring of grief from family, friends, fellow business owners, and members of the tight-knit Minerva community. Minerva Area Chamber of Commerce offered its deepest and most heartfelt condolences to Reagan's family, friends, and loved ones, describing her as a valued member of the local business community and who brought an incredible amount of energy, warmth, and joy to those around her. Well, ABC, more cautious of booking candidates on The View amid FCC pressure. That's according to Disney's First Amendment lawsuit. Disney's First Amendment lawsuit against the Federal Communications Commission alleges The View has had to be circumspect about the content that airs on that program amid the agency's crackdown on ABC stations. FCC under Chairman Brendan Carr, appointed by President Trump, called for an early renewal review of 8 ABC-owned stations licensed in April because their licenses renewals are being originally scheduled between 2028 and 2031. That came after the agency launched a probe into The View in February, triggered by the appearance of Democratic Texas Senate candidate James Tallarico. In the lawsuit pushing back against FCC's crackdown on First Amendment grounds, Disney acknowledged The View has had to curb its bookings. No candidate for public office has appeared on The View since the Bureau's February 2026 inquiry regarding Mr. Tallarico's appearance on February 2nd, 2026, according to the lawsuit. Although there have been no changes in the program's editorial standards regarding the newsworthiness of any candidate who might otherwise have been invited during that period, the cumulative pressure from the FCC's multiple actions against ABC has impacted the program's decisions about which guests to invite. Well, if you have viewed The View for any length of time, you know they're so far left, I don't know how they stand upright. And those pressures have impacted not only potential bookings, but also the video clips that would constitute an appearance on The View under the FCC Equal Opportunities regulation. Plaintiffs have chosen not to air clips, but that otherwise would have aired during the Hot Topics segment of The View, and also in the cold open of the program. Well, GOP Senator, ex-House Democratic, emerged from Alaska's jungle primary despite far-left meddling. 4 candidates advanced out of Alaska's nonpartisan jungle primary on Tuesday evening in one of the races that could decide the balance of power in the U.S. Senate come November. Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican of Alaska, and former Representative Mary Patola, Democrat of Alaska, will advance alongside 2 other currently unknown candidates in the state's 4-candidate general election. The outcome, which pits an incumbent Republican against the only Democrat to win statewide office in Alaska in 50 years, is in line with what many had expected. Also highlights the unique nature of Alaska's primary, as well as attempts to use this process to confuse the voters. And there's a lot of that going around in this midterm. Well, cancer risk may be higher for people with one particular type of job. People who fly for a living could face a higher risk of certain types of cancer, according to a new Harvard study. And of course, if Harvard says it's so, you know it has to be so. Flight attendants and pilots in the U.S. face the highest risk of radiation-related cancer deaths out of a list of more than 500 occupations, according to researchers. As you get high up in the atmosphere, you're exposed to ionizing radiation from the sun. It's called cosmic radiation, according to study author Anupam B. Jena, MD, PhD. The finding was based on analysis of data from the National Vital Statistics System, specifically nearly 13 million U.S. death certificates between 2020 and 2024. Out of those records, 14,000 are pilots and 7,000 are flight attendants. Across all occupations, the team analyzed mortality from radiation-related cancers, including breast cancer, multiple myeloma, leukemia, except chronic lymphocytic leukemia, lymphoma, central nervous system cancers, thyroid cancer, prostate cancer, melanoma, and other non-melanoma skin cancers. They didn't include lung cancer to prevent confounding the results with key smoking-related risk. And pilots and flight attendants were found to have statistically significantly higher mortality rates linked to breast cancer, central nervous system cancers, prostate cancers, and melanoma. Pilots are also more likely to die from leukemia. And among all flight attendant deaths, 6.9% were linked to radiation-related cancers, as were 6.7% of pilots' deaths. This was higher than the rates for any other occupation, the researchers found. Well, President Trump says the U.S. is not seeking MOU extension with Iran as Brent crude oil tops $91 a barrel. President Trump said Monday Tehran wants a deal with Washington but won't accept key terms relating to reiterating Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. President Trump also said he's in no hurry to extend him a memorandum of understanding, the agreement signed by the U.S. and Iran that expired on Monday. Deal called for a peace plan to be in place by now. He threatened to bomb the feces out of Oman if it interferes in back-channel negotiations between Washington and Tehran. Amid the Memorandum of Understanding's expiration, oil prices have been on the rise over the last 24 hours. Brent crude, the world benchmark, has jumped 2.7% since Monday. Iran has said the Strait of Hormuz is open, but that safe passage for ships is far from guaranteed. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan told Trump in a phone call Monday it was important to continue talks with Iran and pursue a diplomatic solution, according to a release from the Turkish president's office. Iran's new security chief declared any U.S. dominance in the Persian Gulf was over while taunting Washington, claiming its inability to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the U.S. imposed sanctions on the two senior International Criminal Court officials. The UAE suspended trade, commercial activity, and financial transactions with Iran, sharply escalating regional tensions. And the UAE suspended trade, commercial activity, and financial transactions with Iran, sharply escalating regional tensions. And Iraq approved a temporary mechanism to export crude oil through international and local companies and multiple export outlets, according to Reuters. And the Pentagon says the U.S. is ready to defeat any threat as Iran or drives munition demand. Well, mysterious polling firm behind a fake election survey is closed after admitting a social experiment. Polling outfit that admitted surveys it released on the Los Angeles mayor's race and the Democratic gubernatorial primary in Wisconsin were fake. That company's now out of business. Median Strategies, the company that released polls, include indicating Democratic Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles and Wisconsin Democratic gubernatorial candidate Francisca Hong, leading their rivals by wide margins, announced this week that the surveys were a hoax, and it is now shut down. Fabricated polls by Median Strategies entered the political information ecosystem and were reported on social media by some local TV newscasts by online media outlets. According to the company's website, Median Strategies was created as a short-term social experiment to examine how purported polling information could enter and spread through the political information ecosystem without independent verification. Media Strategies has concluded its polling project and will not publish additional polls. Well, on that note, we got an interesting topic for today's main show. Now, everybody, of course, is familiar with the Roswell UFO crash and some of the stories that are circulated about that. That took place in 1947. And most people, when you talk about UFOs, that's the one they talk about. But that's not America's first major UFO controversy, not by a long shot. Turns out in 1942, during World War II, a giant alien craft was tracked on radar from about 120 miles off the coast of the U.S. is headed toward Los Angeles. And it followed a path along the shore, behind the mountains and around the largest gun emplacements. You know, during World War II, we had gun emplacements along both coasts. Well, in regard to the one in Los Angeles, over 1,440 anti-aircraft shells are fired at this giant alien craft. The military said it was, after the fact, said it was nothing but war nerves, our imagination, or even maybe a weather balloon. Yes, that's a good explanation. It's got to be a weather balloon. But the LA Times, that purveyor of truth, wasn't afraid we couldn't handle the truth. It did a story about a possible extraterrestrial attack. It didn't hesitate to publish a famous photo showing the image of a very large alien craft at the end of the searchlight beams and in the middle of the bursting shells. So we're going to talk about what became known as the Battle of Los Angeles, which took place in 1942. Remember the massive cover-up at Roswell, where residents were threatened with being locked up for years, and several that were close to the truth died in very mysterious circumstances? The Battle of Los Angeles happened 5 full years before Roswell, so you can't imagine how frantic the government was to keep the truth hidden. So let's talk about what actually happened. At the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942, that was when the city of Los Angeles found itself in the grip of a mass panic. There'd been reports of a Japanese air raid, and local military units sounded warning sirens, and there was a mass blackout, and they lit up the sky with machine gun fire and over 1,440 anti-aircraft shells. The famous Battle of Los Angeles would eventually drag on for hours, terrifying millions of residents in Southern California. Once the immense battle ended and the guns finally fell silent, there was absolutely no evidence of any enemy attack. So the military brass chalked the whole thing up to jittery nerves caused by the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And this still remains one of the most mysterious chapters of World War II. So, a lot of people who lived through it later on, when it became safe to do so, wrote about what they saw and heard. And what we're going to talk about was not in the official reports, not by any means. Now, in the frantic weeks that followed the Pearl Harbor attack, a lot of Americans believed the enemy raids on the continental U.S. were imminent. December 9th, 1941, there were a number of unsubstantiated reports of approaching aircraft that caused a minor invasion panic in New York City and sent stock prices tumbling. And on the West Coast, inexperienced pilots and radar men had mistaken fishing boats and logs and even whales for Japanese warships and submarines. Tensions were high. And they grew after U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson warned that American cities should be prepared to accept occasional blows from enemy forces. A few days later, February 23rd, 1942, Japanese submarines surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. Shot over a dozen artillery shells in an oil field and a refinery. Now, this attack inflicted no casualties, caused only minor damage, but it did mark the first time that the mainland U.S. had been bombed during World War II. Well, the day after the oil field raid, paranoia and itchy trigger fingers combined to produce one of the most unusual home front incidents of the war, which actually began on the evening of February 24th, 1942. When Naval Intelligence instructed the units on the California coast to get ready for a potential Japanese attack. Now, everything was calm for the next few hours, but about 2 in the morning on February 25th, military radar picked up what appeared to be enemy contact about 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Air raid sirens sounded, and there was a citywide blackout put into effect. Within minutes, troops with manned anti-aircraft guns began sweeping the skies with searchlights. Just after 3 in the morning, when the shooting started, there had been reports of an unidentified object in the skies. Troops of Santa Monica unleashed a barrage of anti-aircraft and 50 caliber machine gun fire. Before long, many of the city's other coastal defense weapons joined in. According to what was written later, powerful searchlights from countless stations stabbed the sky with brilliant probing fingers. Los Angeles Times later wrote that while anti-aircraft batteries dotted the heavens with beautiful, if not sinister, orange bursts of shrapnel, chaos reigned over the next several minutes. It appeared that Los Angeles was, in fact, under attack. But many of those who looked up in the sky saw nothing but smoke and the glare of ack fire. Now, imagination could have easily disclosed a lot of shapes in the sky in the midst of that weird symphony of noise and color. That was according to Coastal Artillery Corps Colonel John Murphy. The cold detachment disclosed no planes of any type in the sky, friendly or enemy for that matter. For others, though, the threat appeared to be very real. Reports poured in from across the city, describing Japanese aircraft flying in formation, bombs coming down, enemy paratroopers following the bombs. Even a claim of a Japanese plane crash and landing in the streets of Hollywood. Well, a coastal artilleryman named Charles Patrick later wrote in a letter, "I could barely see the planes, but they were up there all right. I could see 6 planes and shells are bursting all around them. Naturally, all of us fellows were anxious to get our 2 cents worth in, and when the command came, everybody cheered like a son of a gun. The barrage eventually continued for over an hour. By the time a final all-clear order had been given later that morning, Los Angeles artillery batteries had fired over 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition into the sky. It was only in the light of day the American military units made a puzzling discovery. There didn't appear to have been a Japanese attack. Although reports were conflicting and every effort's being made to ascertain the facts, it was clear that no bombs had dropped and no planes were shot down, according to a statement from the Army's Western Defense Command. Ironically, the only damage that occurred during the battle had come from friendly fire. Anti-aircraft shrapnel rained down across the city, shattering windows and ripping through buildings. One dud careened into a Long Beach golf course, and several residents had their homes partially destroyed by 3-inch artillery shells. And while there were no serious injuries from the shootout, at least none that were reported, it was reported that at least 5 people died as a result of heart attacks and car accidents that occurred during the extended blackout. In a preview of the hysteria that would soon accompany the Japanese internment, authorities also arrested 20 Japanese Americans for allegedly trying to signal to the non-existent aircraft. Nobody realized at the time trying to signal a non-existent aircraft was actually a crime. But over 20 were prosecuted for that. Well, it came out all over the Pacific Ocean off the California coast from Los Angeles at an extremely high rate of speed north and west of Point Conception. At 1:44 in the morning, military crews manning equipment and scopes of a secret radar site tucked into the bluffs and hills picked up a unidentified aerial target on a south to east trajectory. And that was officially reported at 1:44 on an SCR-268, which was a type of radar, picked up an unidentifiable aerial target 120 miles west of Los Angeles and tracked it by radar. That came from the history of the 4th AA Command, Western Defense Command, January 9th, 1942 through July 1st, 1945, Chapter 5, Defense Operations on the West Coast. According to that report, 16 minutes later, after receiving data from 2 additional radar sites down its path, the object was backtracked to a coordinated position 20 miles west of and closing in on the city of Los Angeles. At 2:15 in the morning, Los Angeles area anti-aircraft batteries are put on green alert. That means get ready to fire. And at 2:21 in the morning, the regional controller ordered a blackout. Then several minutes shy of passing into the city of Santa Monica's airspace and the path of the waiting anti-aircraft guns, that object vanished. Completely went away. 19 minutes later, residents of Pacific Palisades and the surrounding area observed a huge airborne object east of them, rising up over the Santa Monica Mountains from out of the north. At 3:06 in the morning, at least 4 of the Santa Monica area anti-aircraft batteries turned inland toward the object and started firing out over the city, following its track toward the Baldwin Hills. after being picked up by radar, but before it reached Littleton's house along the Strand in Hermosa Beach, the object paralleled the coastline along Malibu at an ultra-high speed at a very low altitude. And then, for reasons not known, as the object reached an area somewhat east of Point Dume, it slowed to almost a complete crawl, turning sharply northward, skimming over the crest of the mountains and down as if to gain an advantage of being in the radar shadow. After crossing the mountains, it turned eastward and almost immediately coming into the LA basin behind the west, facing radar and anti-aircraft guns. And just after the object turned north at Point Dume before it finished crossing over the mountains and turned north to follow the bottom edges of lower northern slopes on the way to Los Angeles. Over the next few days, government media outlets issued contradictory reports on what later became known as the Battle of Los Angeles. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox dismissed the firefight as a false alarm brought on by jittery nerves. But Secretary of War Henry Stimson echoed Army brass in saying that at least 15 planes had buzzed the city. Even advanced a provocative theory the Phantom fighters might have been commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents, hoping to strike fear into the public. Stimson, of course, later backtracked his claims. But there was still the matter of thousands of military personnel and civilians who claimed to have seen aircraft in the skies over L.A. So what caused the shootout over Los Angeles? The Japanese military later claimed it had never flown aircraft over the city during World War II, providing fuel for a host of bizarre theories involving government conspiracies and visits by flying saucers and extraterrestrials. But in spite of all the witnesses' sightings, it was claimed that the most logical explanation for the firefight is trigger-happy servicemen and rudimentary radar systems combined to produce a false alarm. So, was the Battle of Los Angeles just a mirage? Whatever the real story was, it was definitely a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that many Americans felt at the beginning of World War II, and a lead into the days ahead when the Japanese would actually hatch several schemes to attack the American mainland, such as launching over 9,000 explosive-laden fire balloons. That was their answer to weather balloons. Although none of these attacks ever produced the level of mass hysteria that accompanied the Phantom shootout over Los Angeles. Even at that time, many journalists noted it was fitting that the incident had taken place in the home of the film industry. An article from March of 1942, the New York Times wrote that as the world's preeminent fabricator of make-believe, Hollywood appeared to have played host to a battle that was just another illusion. Representative Leland Ford of Santa Monica called for a congressional investigation. He said none of the explanations so far offered removed the episode from the category of complete mystification. It was either a practice raid or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid or a raid to lay a political foundation to take away Southern California's war industries. Well, the 4th Air Force had indicated its belief there were no planes over Los Angeles. But the Army didn't publish these initial conclusions. Instead, it waited a day till after a thorough examination of witnesses had been finished. On the basis of these hearings, local commanders altered their verdict, indicated a belief that from 1 to 5 unidentified airplanes had been over the city of Los Angeles. Secretary of War Stimson announced this conclusion as the War Department version of the incident, and he advanced 2 theories to account for the mysterious craft. Either they were commercial planes operated by an enemy from secret fields in California or Mexico, or they were light planes launched from Japanese submarines. In either case, the enemy's purpose must have been to locate anti-aircraft defenses in the area or deliver a blow at civilian morale. The divergence of views between the War and the Navy departments and unsatisfying conjectures advanced by the Army to explain the affair touched off a vigorous public discussion. While documenting the incident in 1949, the U.S. Coastal Artillery Association identified a meteorological balloon that started all the shooting, concluded that once the firing started, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky, and everybody joined in. In 1983, the Office of Air Force History also concluded that meteorological balloons had likely triggered the event. Careful study of the evidence suggests that meteorological balloons known to have been released over Los Angeles may well have caused the initial alarm. That theory is supported by the fact that anti-aircraft artillery units were officially criticized for having wasted ammunition on targets that moved too slow that had been airplanes. Well, the balloons were released from each of the dozen anti-aircraft positions around the city every 6 hours. The balloons were illuminated from below by an enclosed candle that would reflect off the silver lining of the balloon itself to ensure it was visible at night. 1983, the Office of Air Force History outlined the events of the LA air raid and noted that meteorological balloons had been released prior to the barrage to help determine wind conditions. The lights in silver color could have been mistaken for enemy aircraft. Well, reports suggest that gunners from all but one battery mistook the balloons for planes and opened fire. Interestingly, the only gun battery that didn't fire, D Battery, the 203rd Coast Artillery Regiment, was directly in the supposed flight path of reported aircraft. And it was this company that had most recently launched its balloons at 3 o'clock in the morning, shortly before the firing started. Afterward, the staff at the battery were instructed not to mention the balloons, and the commanding officer, Colonel Ray Watson, was pensioned off, sent home. Never spotters and gun crews ordered to be in a strict state of readiness against renewed attacks likely contributed to the confused shelling. And if each of these batteries were normally releasing these weather balloons every 6 hours, why now would everybody confuse these balloons with planes? Wouldn't they be used to seeing and tracking them? That would seem logical to me. It also seems probable that many of the shell bursts were themselves mistaken for aircraft, and this led to the wildly fluctuating reports on the number, speed, and altitude of the aerial objects. Further confusion occurred when the Navy and the Army issued different statements. Navy claiming it was a false alarm, no planes had been over Los Angeles, while the Army stated there were possibly 5 light enemy aircraft launched from secret bases in California and Mexico or from offshore submarines. And the Japanese did have that capability. Memo from President Roosevelt to President Roosevelt from the Army stated there was no evidence of bombs being dropped. Troop casualties reported or planes being shot down. President's response was to suggest that the power to order an air alarm should be restricted to U.S. Army officials. The ufologist argued that a balloon subject to shelling would have popped, but there's evidence that anti-aircraft fire might be less effective against Zeppelin-type airships and balloons than common sense would suggest. Rigid and semi-rigid aircraft don't rely on substantial overpressure to sustain their shape, and unlike a party balloon, won't necessarily pop and deflate immediately when punctured. Flexibility of a balloon or a blimp's gas bag also provides some protection from explosive anti-aircraft fire, with the skin denting and distorting to absorb the impact without actually puncturing. This was exploited in experimental spy blimps such as the LEMV. This means that a balloon may well be able to sustain damage from the anti-aircraft fire and not be actually shot down immediately. And secondly, it isn't guaranteed that a hydrogen dirigible or balloon will ignite when hit by normal bullets or shrapnel common to anti-aircraft fire. During World War I, a Zeppelin, the L-33, was hit by anti-aircraft fire but didn't catch fire. The ship was forced to crash land in Britain, where her crew set her on fire. Fighter aircraft only began to see successes against Zeppelins when they switched from normal ammunition to a mixture of explosive and phosphorus incendiary bullets. Combination of these fired at a Zeppelin would invariably ignite the ship's hydrogen gas bags. This adds some credence to the possibility that shrapnel from the anti-aircraft batteries wouldn't necessarily have destroyed a balloon outright, but would have punctured it, leaving it to descend into and later sink into the Pacific Ocean. Isn't a guaranteed explanation, though. Fugo balloons, if they did make an appearance earlier than officially recorded, did operate with some hydrogen overpressure, and a small number were recorded as being shot down by fighter aircraft. Primary difficulty in tracking them was their high altitude and surprisingly fast speed, rather than Zeppelin-like resilience. Well, the Japanese fire balloon was a prime suspect, but its appearance at this time would have been 2 to 3 years too early. There's been some speculation it could have been a Japanese Fugo bombing balloon, but these were only launched against America from 1944 onwards. However, their existence was kept a secret till the balloon bomb killed 6 picnickers in Oregon. these devices had somehow reached LA, then neither the U.S. nor Japan has records as evidence of their existence. The idea of balloons as long-range weapons is older than the Japanese weapons, with a British study into their effectiveness commissioned as early as 1937. Operation Outward, as it was known, was approved in late 41 and launched its first offensive balloons in March of 42. Continued until the D-Day landings and ending completely in September 1944. Although it's highly unlikely, if not impossible, that these short-range and low-altitude balloons, which were a cost-effective nuisance and distraction from the Luftwaffe more than a deadly threat, would have been present on the west coast of America. It does demonstrate the concept was around in the early 40s. According to an editorial in the New York Times, some eyewitnesses had spotted a big floating object resembling a balloon. Others had spotted anywhere from one plane to several dozen. The more the whole incident of the early morning of February 25th in the LA district is examined, the article said, the more incredible it becomes. Some contemporary press outlets suspected a cover-up. One editorial in the Long Beach Independent wrote there's a mysterious reticence about the whole affair, and it appears that some form of censorship is trying to halt discussion on the matter. Speculation was rampant as to invading airplanes and their bases. Theories included a secret base in northern Mexico, as well as Japanese submarines stationed offshore with the capability of carrying planes. Others speculated the incident was either staged or exaggerated to give coastal defense industries an excuse to move further inland. Strong editorial in the Washington Post on February 27th called the handling of the Los Angeles episode a recipe for jitters and censored the military authorities for what it called stubborn silence in the face of widespread uncertainty. Well, the editorial suggested that the Army's theory that commercial planes might have caused the alert explains everything except where the planes came from, where they were going, and why no American planes were sent to pursue them. The New York Times on February 28th expressed a belief that the more the incident was studied, the more incredible it became. If the batteries are firing at nothing at all, as Secretary Knox implies, it's a sign of expensive, incompetent, and jitters. One photo published in the Los Angeles Times on February 26, 1942, has been cited by some ufologists and conspiracy theories as evidence of an extraterrestrial visitation. They assert that the photo clearly shows searchlights focused on an alien spacecraft. However, the photo was heavily modified by photo retouching prior to publication, which was a routine practice in graphic arts of the time, intended to improve contrast in black and white photos. In the February 24, 1992 Los Angeles Times article, Jack Smith reported what happened next. It was on the night of February 25, 1942, that Los Angeles experienced the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, a night when everybody's fears apparently were realized. Japan had brought the war to mainland America, and Los Angeles was the target. The Great Air Raid began about 2:25 in the morning on that clear moonlit night when the U.S. Army announced the approach of a hostile aircraft, and the city's air raid warning system went into action for the first time in the war. Suddenly the night was torn by sirens, searchlights swept the sky, gun crews at Army posts along the coastline began pumping ack-ack into the moonlight. In the entire episode, according to later reports, 1,433 rounds will be fired. And what goes up does have to come down someplace, usually in the city. Thousands of volunteer air raid wardens tumbled from their beds and grabbed their boots and helmets, those who had the helmets, of course, and rushed into the night. Tens of thousands of citizens, awakened by the screech of sirens and the popping of shells, jumped out of bed and, regardless of blackout regulations, began snapping on lights. It was absolute, total pandemonium. So how come nobody's mentioned aliens yet? Well, if you've been following this story, there's more to come. With all the talk about balloons, numerous small planes, and a huge object coming from the sea at high speed, disappearing and reappearing, and then traveling at low speeds or even hovering while being attacked by anti-aircraft shells, not even being phased by them or making any effort to avoid them. What else could these be besides alien craft? Well, the numerous witnesses that saw groups of planes, and maybe they weren't imagining everything, They could have been seeing smaller alien craft or probes released by the largest ship, as had often been reported over the years. And some of the photos do show the explosions going off in a circle around that large object, but not hitting or even getting close to it. Of course, if it was an alien craft, it probably had a force field. The occupants had no reason to fear our puny weapons. And this may not be public knowledge at the time, but some of our new stealth fighter planes are equipped with an alien type of force field. So why would this alien craft just sit there right in the middle of all this? Well, what better spot to observe the action than right in the middle of it? It's been shown with our development and testing of the atom bomb, this attracted numerous off-planet observers, very interested in our weapons and what we're doing with them. Let's not forget the Foo Fighters are observed all over Europe during the fighting and the alien craft that it was said to crash near Roswell, obviously checking out our atomic weapons. Well, maybe it's just in weapons technology that interests the aliens, but our conflicts themselves. During our earthly wars, we send war correspondents to the front lines to get the latest developments so we can sit around TVs and watch it. Could be the same thing with the aliens. Most likely they're constantly recording us humans to play back to their own citizens as entertainment. We might call it the episodes of Life on the Blue Planet, humans and all their folly. Well, obviously there were serious intentions afoot here on the part of whoever these visitors were. Were they here to observe our weapons and defense systems? Obviously, if they were interested in attacking us, our puny weapons would make no difference to them, since they came under a powerful military attack by human standards anyway, and they didn't retaliate or even defend themselves. They must have been on what you might describe as a peace mission. War has been breaking out around the world. Powerful atomic weapons are being developed. Most likely they were observing and trying to prevent damage to this planet, the universe, and even beyond that. So were they trying to send us a warning message to knock it off, or maybe they were on a mission to land and help us resolve the mess we were in and continue to make on this planet? Then there was the great welcoming greeting we gave these envoys of peace. After all, these so-called aliens, this might be more of a responsibility for keeping the peace on Earth than we do. And many of us believed that it was the visitors who created or recreated us as humans and been actively caring for and protecting this planet for eons. There's enough evidence to show that certain alien groups have protected us and this planet from an invasion for countless years. In 1983, the U.S. Government Printing Office released a multi-volume set entitled The Army Air Forces in World War II, edited by Wesley Frank Craven and James Lee Cate. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section 8, page 283, there's found what is nothing short of an official confirmation of such a scenario. The volume specifically cites the use of radar, which many people insist was not functionally operational in 1942, although the government seems to differ in the contents of this document, as well as the fact that the object simply disappeared and vanished over the ocean during its in-flight path toward Los Angeles. Well, according to this particular product of the Government Printing Office, it was in the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942, suddenly appearing out of nowhere, but most likely doing so only after dropping out of the night sky initially from a steep angle out of the Pacific on a curving southeast trajectory. Used object of unknown origin, possibly with protective detection devices on at a lower altitude levels off the coast. The object continued on the trajectory east toward the city of Los Angeles at an ultra-high speed, barely skimming the water just above the surface. At 120 miles out, the object most likely picks up electronic probes from the Army long-range listening apparatus or rudimentary early radar and retracts its entry shields, reducing the speed to a near crawl some 50 miles out, turning inland somewhere near Point Duma. Scattered eyewitness accounts from years later picked up the object apparently dropping down into the radar shadow by hugging the mostly unpopulated ridge line along the north side of the Santa Monica Mountains in an easterly direction. Then it turned south in the gap in the mountains around Sepulveda Boulevard and Mulholland Drive, and coming in behind the aim direction of the majority of the anti-aircraft guns and any possible radar and long-range listening devices. In the continuing steeply angled climb out of the Santa Monica Mountains, the object curves slightly to the east, around and west, and well above the 511-foot altitude of Baldwin Hills, in what appears to be a concerted effort to stay away from all the potential anti-aircraft armament associated with the mines field, now known as LAX. The object then turned westward toward the ocean, coming out over the aircraft manufacturing plants near El Segundo Tank Farm, and then dropping altitude south along the coast. Earlier, the unidentified target continued on its apparent approach toward the Los Angeles area, only to disappear behind the mountains inland. A lot of folks believed the aircraft they'd seen was extraterrestrial. One eyewitness even described an object he'd seen as looking like an enormous flying lozenge. And some accused the government of a cover-up. Conflicting accounts of the incident from the Navy and War Departments didn't help clarify matters. As if to confirm public fears of extraterrestrial attack, one famous LA Times photograph emerged from the incident showing an ominous, saucer-like object hovering over the city. This much-debated photograph inspired America's first major UFO controversy, 5 years before Roswell took place. And to this day, nobody knows for sure what flew over Los Angeles that night and evaded the city's air defenses. Did a UFO really invade Los Angeles in 1942? Well, all you can do is look at the evidence and decide for yourself. Naturally, of course, ufologists believe an alien spacecraft was to blame. Decades after the incident, they began to question the fact that it had been a false alarm. Some attempts were made to tie the incident to the often referred to MJ-12 documents. Secondhand stories surfaced alleging that War of the Worlds type spaceships cruised over L.A. Ufologists claimed that a certain photo showed a huge flying saucer caught in the searchlights. They challenged the idea that a balloon of some kind could have triggered the anti-aircraft free-for-all. And although the eventual official story was the object was nothing more than a barrage balloon that had come loose, a lot of folks profoundly disagreed with this version of events, particularly those who believed they saw the object close up on the night in question. The 37th Brigade was relentless in its attempt to bring down this large object, but found no success. The barrage of spent shells would follow the entire area. No place was safe that night. A lot of folks were injured, and there was even reports of death from the falling shells. According to newspaper reports, eyewitnesses described the sight of the UFO like a surreal hanging magic lantern. One of those witnesses, a volunteer air raid warden by the name of Katie, stated after being awakened by a telephone call from an air raid supervisor, she looked out her window and saw a huge object hovering over her house. She said it was huge, it was enormous, practically right over my house. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Just hovering there in the sky and hardly moving at all. And she claimed she had a clear view of the aircraft, and it shone like a lovely pale orange as it remained motionless in the night sky. She also recorded seeing several groups of American fighter planes attempt to engage the object, but each time they had to retreat, stating they were shooting at it, but it didn't seem to bother them. Another witness, retired anthropology professor C. Scott Littleton, was 13 years old at the time of the incident. His father was an air raid warden and was convinced the actions were real. Littleton claimed the craft he saw was a distinct oval shape like a lozenge, and he had witnessed anti-aircraft shells explode all around it. Well, on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. Littleton, like Katie, also stated he witnessed American fighter planes following that strange object as it made its way toward Redondo Beach before vanishing from view. There's a lot of conflicting stories about what happened that night. We're going to thoroughly discuss it over the next couple of shows. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a true great evening.